Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in to Exploring Reality, where you get to learn how to share the rational side of the Christian faith. This starts the project called the Resurrection Project. And I think this is important to talk about because nowadays, especially, people like to make fun of Christianity and call the event that our faith hinges on, the resurrection, kind of a fairy tale. They like to make fun of Jesus and call him a zombie magician. And so I think we need to be knowledgeable about the facts surrounding the resurrection. This is the first video in this whole project, and today we're going to be covering three topics, two small ones and then one big one. The first two small topics are just going to be talking about how do you debunk Christianity. Another one's just going to be a simple justification for God's existence and the supernatural. And then a big chunk of this video is going to be talking about miracles. So with that, let's get into it. So, how do you debunk Christianity? Well, there's two things really that our faith hinges on, right? God's existence and the resurrection. If the resurrection never happened, well, then we have no Jesus that we should be following. Even Paul himself writes this. If Jesus was never resurrected, then he was a liar, or he was just a lunatic, or whatever it might be. But if he never resurrected, it means he probably was not God. He even foretold of his resurrection in John 2:18-22, chapter 10, 17 through 18, Matthew 12, 39 through 40, Matthew 16, verse 21, so on and so forth. It would also mean all his disciples were liars and or deceived themselves. And so there's a lot more to be said on this topic, but as we move on, just keep that in mind. Next, does a theistic being exist? Does God exist? Does the supernatural exist? Why is this important? Well, without a theistic being or the supernatural existing, we have very little reason to accept anything supernatural happening. The purpose of this next exercise is not really to prove God's existence or prove the supernatural exists, and this is not going to be an exhaustive exercise on this topic. If you want an exhaustive exercise on the topic, I have other videos that you can watch and critique even if you disagree with me on these topics. This, again, merely is just to serve as a foundation and a justification for things we'll be talking about throughout the conversation surrounding Jesus' resurrection. Two basic arguments for God. One is more like a common level one, and the next is like my personal favorite one. So the Kalam cosmological argument goes, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And the analysis of the cause would be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal, powerful, intelligent. It's safe to say that something like that would be God. Now, my personal favorite argument, which I'll be making a separate video on at some point, it's called the Modal Contingency argument. And it goes like this. The universe can have an explanation. The universe cannot be explained solely in terms of non-maximally great things. Therefore, the universe can be explained in terms of God. Therefore, God can exist. God can't exist unless God exists in all possible worlds. Therefore, God exists in all possible worlds, including ours. And so again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive work on these arguments. These are just a justification for us to believe that the supernatural exists or God exists. So given that these arguments are valid arguments for God's existence, we can therefore operate under the assumption that it's possible that things outside of the laws and patterns of nature exist and can happen. So let's first define a miracle. My personal favorite definition goes as follows. An extraordinary event manifesting divine intervention in human affairs that is not explainable by natural laws. Some examples of a miracle would be someone getting prayed for and healed instantly, or someone being raised from the dead. Moving on, let's define a few things here. While I don't necessarily like these definitions on the broad side of the conversation, I think they're sufficient for the purposes of the conversation. So, natural means anything referring to the physical and material properties of the universe. Supernatural, anything that transcends the natural realm. Since miracles are supernatural events, we need to justify belief in the supernatural in order to believe the supernatural, which we did earlier in the process of going through deductive arguments for God's existence. Since God, by definition, is supernatural, we can now justify the belief in the supernatural, which means miracles are possible. Next, the problem of possibility, though. It seems to me that people tend to reject the mere possibility of miracles altogether, yet have no justification for their position. For one to say that they are impossible, they would have to argue that it isn't possible for the supernatural to exist. And so long as it's even possible God exists, miracles are possible. So to the person who throws out the mere possibility of miracles, you must have a justification for ruling them out. Now, most people will appeal to David Hume, a old philosopher, and that's where we're going to go next. Hume talks a lot about miracles in his essay, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of what he talks about and kind of just going over some of his arguments and showing where they fail. Many argue, along with Hume, that miracles can never happen and have never happened because they are violations of the laws of nature. The way Hume really goes about this in his essay that he wrote centuries ago is that the laws of nature are an unalterable experience that we all have, and that these are a proof against the miracle. And so, imagine it is a miracle that a dead man should come to light. Because that has never been observed in any age or country, there must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event. So he basically says that because miracles violate the laws of nature, and because the experience of ordinary history confirms this principle, therefore, because miracles are outside of our experience, which establishes the laws of nature, they are impossible. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that there's a number of issues with the way Hume looks at this. First is the idea of how Hume established the laws of nature through unalterable experience. Hume and others like him haven't evaluated all of human experience. They have merely evaluated only their own experience rather than all of humanity's experience. In addition, one has to realize that humanity has not yet seen everything there is to see, nor solve everything that there is to solve. So you can't say your experience establishes unalterable laws. And so you can't make an immutable law of nature just from your experience or what you've observed. How could he say that his experience excludes the possibility of miracles? Especially when not everyone agrees with him. If human experience, which includes all humans, establishes the laws of nature and establishes they cannot be violated, well, then how does Hume account for the people who do report miracles in their experience? For instance, the apostles. Their experience, along with many other people's experiences, contradict Hume's experiences. And so, to further this point, let's look at some polls. In 1975, the National Opinion Research Center says that 35% of people claimed to have seen or witnessed or experienced some sort of miracle. In 1978, the Princeton Research Center says 35% did. In 1978, Britain National Opinion Poll says 36% did. In year 2000, BBC's Soul of Britain survey says 76% did. Science or Miracle Holiday Season Survey reveals physicians' view of faith, prayer, and miracles. And this was by the Business Wire, December 20th, 2004. Of the 1,100 physicians polled nationally, only 12% claimed to reject biblical descriptions of miracles. 37% affirmed them as literally true, and 50% as metaphorically true. Roughly 2/3 viewed the Bible as inspired. The study was conducted by HCD Research in Flemington, New Jersey, and the Louis Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies of the Jewish Theological Seminary. In 2009, Pew Research Center, 49% said that they established some sort of experience with a miracle. So why bring this all up? Part of Hume's argument was that human experience invalidates the possibility of miracles. Yet, we have all this evidence to the contrary. And so Hume's theory doesn't actually do what he says it does unless you do what David Hume and many others do, which is either call people mistaken or liars. But then you would be arguing in a circle, for the only reason for denying that they happened would be your presupposition that they are impossible. Miracles are impossible because they go against all of human experience. Well, what about the people who do experience them? They're lying. Why? Because miracles are impossible and they go against all human experience. And something interesting is that even some atheists recognize the failure of this argument. John Ehrman wrote a book, Hume's Abject Failure. And on the very first page he writes, Section X of Miracles in Hume's Enquiry concerning humans' understanding is a failure. And he then uses Bayes' theorem, something we'll be talking about later on, to show that Hume's argument doesn't work. Hume is simply presupposing miracles cannot happen in order to say miracles cannot happen. He then brings up how Hume's contemporaries brought up a thought experiment about an Indian prince who has never seen ice. By Hume's logic, he is correct in believing that there is no such thing as ice from hearing reports of its existence. Because that would be extraordinary by his experience alone. And so he could say it's impossible for ice to exist. And Hume's only response was that ice is not outside of all human experience. Ehrman then shows the issue on page 33-38. And he writes, there was a time when all human experience was limited to a small group that arose in Africa. And so at this point, by Hume's logic, ice violates natural law in human experience. And this is the exact problem one has when trying to apply Hume's structure of reasoning to reports of miracles. And so we can see here that Hume's argument is circular. Now on to the next part of Hume's argument. He says that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. In other words, what Hume is saying here is that the miracle itself must be more probable than if the person was lying when reporting the miracle. And to that I would say I agree. We should be evaluating the evidence for a specific miracle claim and weigh the options to see which of the options are more probable. For example, when it comes to the resurrection, Christians will argue that it's more likely that Jesus rose from the dead than everybody being mistaken, hallucinating, lying, whatever it might be. And so in other words, Hume has said nothing profound. Christians should be agreeing with him at this point. This is a point of agreement between both sides. Next, another part of Hume's argument. Are they violations of the laws of nature? Simply put, the answer is no. First of all, Hume was not the first person to define miracles. And nobody agreed that Hume's definition should be the universally accepted one either. For example, Thomas Aquinas said a miracle is an event beyond the powers of the natural order. He says this in the Summa Contra. Or we have Samuel Clarke, who says a miracle is an effect produced contrary to the usual course of order of nature by the unusual interposition of some intelligent being superior to men. And he says this in a demonstration of the being and attributes of God and other on page 150. And so this understanding of a miracle better captures the idea. It's when an agent outside of the natural world inserts or changes something in the system that the natural world cannot do through its own self. Secondly, the laws of nature are only meant to describe the effects of how natural things operate if left alone. These are not prescriptive laws. They're only just describing how nature acts. That means natural laws don't rule out the possibility of an outside agent to change or insert something into the system. The laws of nature describe what would happen in a particular case, assuming that there are no intervening supernatural factors. These laws have an embedded clause in them, namely that these laws depend on everything else remaining the same. In other words, there will be causal factors of work, namely God, which are supernatural, and therefore what the laws of nature predict won't happen because the laws of nature only make predictions under the assumption that there are no intervening supernatural factors at work. I like the way C.S. Lewis puts this in a thought experiment. He says, if I put 1,000 pounds in a drawer one day, 2,000 the next, and 1,000 after that, I should expect to have 4,000 pounds because of the laws of arithmetic. But suppose when I next open the drawer, I find only 1,000 pounds. What shall I conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken? Certainly not. I might more reasonably conclude that some thief has broken the laws of the state and stolen 3,000 pounds out of my drawer. Furthermore, it would be ludicrous to claim that the laws of arithmetic made it impossible to believe in the existence of such a thief, or that the possibility of this intervention. On the contrary, it is the normal workings of those laws that have exposed the existence and the activity of the thief. And so clearly, David Hume seems a little mistaken here, but I want to drive the point just a little bit further. Let's talk about the main views of natural laws. There are three main views. There's gnomic necessity theory, and this says that the laws of nature are just basic principles which govern the natural phenomena of the world. That is, the natural world obeys the laws of nature. In other words, natural laws are describing what the natural world can and can't do on its own. Another theory that most people hold to is the regularity theory. This says that the laws of nature are just statements of the uniformities or regularities of the world. They are mere descriptions of the way the world is. Next is the causal disposition theory. And this says that nature has dispositions that cause it to act a certain way. For example, salt has a disposition to dissolve in water. A more academic way of putting that would just be that natural laws are metaphysically necessary truths about what causal dispositions are possessed by various natural kinds of things. None of these theories contradict the existence of miracles. Under all of these views, miracles would not violate the laws of nature because the event's origin is not natural or from within nature. Remember, under all these views of what natural laws are, they're just universal inductive generalizations of the natural world. So all in all, when looking at the types of arguments people mount against miracles, it all seems to fall apart when we look at it more in depth. Now, a few more things I want to talk about. I want to talk about miracles themselves. Documented miracles, reported miracles. What does it take to document a current day miracle? According to researchers of miracles, you would want it to be complete, instantaneous, durable, and scientifically inexplicable. The steps you would take would be to, when possible, observe spiritual healings, obtain medical records, assess and expert review the case, and publish it. So I want to dive into a few different medically documented miracles. We're going to talk about two big ones and then some other ones that I'll share with you. So here's the first case report, titled Instantaneous Resolution of Juvenile Macular Degeneration Blindness After Proximal Intercessory Prayer. So here are the sources for this. Global Medical Research Institute, Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center in Lubbock, Texas, and the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, Indiana University. Here are the highlights of the case. A young woman was presented with sudden bilateral vision loss and atrophy in each fovea. She was diagnosed with juvenile macular degeneration and was blind for 12 years. After a brief proximal intercessory prayer experience, she regained her eyesight. Her eyesight has remained 20/40 or better for over 40 years since the event. If you want a link to this, it'll be in the description of the video. Another case study. This one's titled Gastropariasis Healing, 16 Years of Chronic Syndrome Resolved After Proximal Intercessory Prayer. Here are the sources, the Global Medical Research Institute, and again, Indiana University. Here are the highlights. A male infant at 2 weeks of age was hospitalized, vomiting forcefully. He had pleuropneumotomy. For 16 years, he was completely dependent on J-tube feeding. In November 2011, he experienced proximal intercessory prayer at a church. After the prayer experience, he was unexpectedly able to tolerate oral feedings. Over 7 years, he has been free from symptoms. And again, link in the description to the case study here. A few more documented miracles that I'm not going to go into depth with. Chief of Thoracic Surgery Michael Reed wrote a book, Surgery, and in pages 35 and 52 through 53, he cites cases of cancer that had been already metastasized and spread, being healed abruptly after prayer. Craig Keener, in his book Miracles, cites a few different sources and writes, yet another doctor provided in his book more substantial medical documentation, including x-rays and the like, for the following cases of extraordinary healings after prayer, though some of these are more medically inexplicable than others. And then he goes on and lists these. Lisa Larios, healed of reticulum cell sarcoma of the right pelvic bone. Alfreda Stauffer, healed of chronic rheumatoid arthritis with severe disability. Marie Rosenberger, healed of malignant brain tumor of the left temporal lobe. Marion Bergio, healed of multiple sclerosis. Marvin Bird, healed of I'm not going to say that. Heart disease. B. Ray Jackson, healed of carcinoma of the kidney with diffuse bony metastases. Pearl Bryant, healed of mixed rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. Ann Soltz, healed of probable brain tumor versus infarction of the brain. Paul Truesdale, instantly healed of massive GI hemorrhage with shock. Dolores Winder, healed of osteoporosis of the entire spine with intractable pain requiring bilateral cordomides. And this is all in Craig Keener's book, Miracles, on pages 714 through 715. And his source for this was Dr. Richard Castorf's book, Miracles, and all the pages shown here. Next, I want to go into something similar but a little bit different. Reported miracles. The big difference here is that documented miracles have a lot of evidence to them, x-rays, medical documentation, and a lot of science that goes with them. Reported miracles, on the other hand, are just testimonies. So, while reported miracles are not as strong of a case on their own, they make a strong case when we look at them together. In Craig Keener's book, Miracles, he covers over 600 reported miracles with their sources as well as some accompanying academic sources. And so I want to cover some specific types of miracles that seem to negate a common objection to miracles, namely that they are psychosomatic, meaning that they are more of a placebo effect from anticipation of healings. It seems, though, that some miracles, like healings of blindness and the inability to walk, they cannot be psychosomatic, especially if they are lasting healings. And so with that, I want to turn our attention to different types of miracles that are reported throughout the world. First, let's talk about some reports of miracles of people being healed of blindness. One example that Craig Keener reports in his book Miracles on page 515 is a story of 3 children in Africa who were all healed at once and all together. And he received this report from Dr. Michael Brown on November 15th, 2008, who got the report from Daniel Kalenda, October 9th, 2008. In the same paragraph, Keener talks about another report and writes, a fetish priest who had recently lost his sight came to Seth Ablor, a U.S.-trained Ghanaian doctor. Finding no pathology, Ablor irrigated the man's eyes and asked if he might pray for him. The priest demurred, but returned 3 days later, still blind and now willing to receive prayer. Ablor irrigated his eyes again, prayed, and then retired to his office to pray further. Suddenly, his office prayers were interrupted as people outside began shouting, "He can see, he can see." This is on Keener's book Miracles, page 515. A few other sources here. In Baker's book Enough, and also a testimony of a retired radiologist in Brown's book Awakenings on page 363, there are reports of people visibly seeing the disappearance of cataracts. One more reported miracle on blindness in Keener's book. He writes, in May 1973, in Oganaland, Nigeria, the eyes of a 5 or 6 year old girl born blind looked like empty sockets with skin draped over them. No slits were visible in the eyelids. When Jeffrey Numbre, whom we encountered in chapter 9, prayed, she opened her eyes and could see. A blind boy was also healed at that time, and much of the village of Dure was converted. And this is in Keener's book, Miracles, page 516. And Keener's source for this was also Numbre Vision 121. The book mentions other blind persons being healed as well. Next, I now want to move to reports of people who reported an inability to walk. They were paraplegics, and then went and were miraculously healed. The following are just excerpts from Keener's book Miracles. For example, in Nepal, Meena KC prayed for a 20-year-old Hindu woman named Khanita who had been paralyzed from birth, helped neither by doctors nor by sacrifices. The next week, Khanita, who had never before walked to church. In another report, in a case not initially intended as evangelism, a Christian doctor recognized that a North Indian patient's legs, paralyzed in a permanently sitting position, were inoperable. Lacking another way to help the man, he therefore just prayed for him, and the man was instantly healed. In Nigeria, a father carried a 6-year-old boy who had never been able to walk, seeking prayer. Dr. Chauncey Crandall prayed, and as he was going on to the next person, the boy began running. The parents fell to the dirt, weeping, and 24 people who had accompanied them from the village began shouting. Another big report, with some actual video evidence, I guess you could call it, of the reported miracle, is Delia Knox. She was paralyzed for 22 years after a car accident. Multiple attempts were even made to heal her through prayer. And in 2010, she was prayed for and able to walk during a session. And she is perfectly mobile today. Ed Riley of Channel 17 Eyewitness News reported during the revival, Delia heard a voice telling her to just get up. After being prayed for, she rose from her wheelchair and began to move her legs. With assistance, she walked in front of the amazed audience. The list goes on and on and on of these types of reports. Now, I do want to point out that this next set of miracles that are reported, I'm skeptical of myself, but I can't ultimately rule them out. These are reports of people being raised from the dead. And so, in Keener's book, he writes that accounts of resurrections abound in Africa. In Nigeria, for instance, when an evangelism team member, Lolo George, suddenly died in the midst of Juju territory on the morning of October 15th, 1973, Jeffrey Numbre and other workers prayed until around noon. She returned to life and began recovering strength. Another report several months later. When Franz Isaiah, brother of local ruler of Akwali, died, local believers felt compelled to pray for his raising. They went in to pray for the corpse before burial, while onlookers mocked, waiting for the coffin. After several hours of continued prayer and mockery, the man sat up, alive, and asked for water, and the gospel spread widely in Akwali. Frank Isaiah lived more than 20 more years and had more children, dying finally on September 2nd, 1995. Philip Isaiah, one of Frank's sons, was converted through witnessing the miracle and remains a pastor in Numberi's circle of churches today. Another account, evangelist Daniel Kalinda reported that after a meeting on December 12, 2009, a weeping mother asked him for prayer. She was holding the limp body of her 3-year-old boy, whom both she and the ushers at this meeting in Nigeria believed to be dead. The ushers had tried to send her to the medical tent earlier, but she insisted on waiting until the service was over for prayer. He prayed for about 30 seconds and handed the child back. The next night, the mother was back. She had brought her son, and he was perfectly well. They told us that the child had come back to life almost immediately after the prayer. This again only scratches the surface of the reports we see of these types of miracles worldwide. And so, I don't want to present all these cases as a slam dunk to the validity of miracles. Like I said, I myself take a skeptical approach to them. Part of the reason is that witnesses can be faulty, and sometimes scam artists will deliberately set up an account. Like we covered, a lot of miracle reports, if they're not extra miraculous, they seem to be easily written off as statistical anomalies or psychosomatic. And so again, I don't want to pretend like every single miracle claim is 100% true. And I don't believe they are either. In fact, I think a lot of talk of miracles can be chalked up to some sort of other explanation, fraud, or mistaken assumptions. But putting that aside, think about the trillions of people throughout all of history that claim to have experienced some sort of miracle. We've gone over why simply assuming that they're all mistaken or lying is wrong. We've covered why Hume's arguments against them are wrong. We've covered medically documented miracles, and we've covered just a tiny fraction of reported miracles all over the world throughout history. I contend here that I no longer really need to press the issue. Remember, the point here is that we're just asking the question, are miracles possible? And given that we have a justification for God and a supernatural existing, and that we have a mix of documented and reported miracles, it seems that we've exhausted all the topics and done our due diligence to just say that they're possible. And so with all that being said, this concludes the first part of the Resurrection Project. We talked about how do you debunk Christianity, we talked about God's existence and the supernatural, and then we talked about miracles pretty heavily. If you're curious about any of the sources that I use for this video, everything will be cited in the description of the video. Please remember to like and subscribe. And remember that I'm still building my monthly support team. So if you feel like God is leading you to supporting my ministry, please reach out and I'd be happy to talk to you.